Hello, and welcome to everyone joining us here today. My name is Claire Sanders, and I'm with the Climate Risk Institute. I'm here with my colleague, Katarina Lotzen from GIZ, and we're here today on behalf of our colleagues, Dan Sanding from the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction and Eric Sparling from the Climate Risk Institute. Together with the Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation, we make up the PIEVC Alliance. And a special welcome today to those of you joining us from outside of Canada. We want to invite all participants to introduce themselves in the chat. As a reminder, this is the 5th webinar of an 8-webinar series focused on the use of the PIEVC protocol for factoring climate change impacts into plans for design, operation, and maintenance of infrastructure and buildings. If you missed the earlier webinars, recordings are on CRI's website, and I will put the link into the chat as well. The first webinar in August was an introduction to PIEVC and background on the Alliance. The second webinar in September was on implementing recommendations from a PIEVC assessment. In October, we listened to several panelists about institutionalizing PIEVC. And in November, we discussed the use of climate services in the PIEVC process. In each webinar, we featured both Canadian and international examples. So on to today's webinar. The focus of today's webinar is on climate risk and vulnerability assessments for analyzing large infrastructure portfolios. We have 3 presentations this week, and we will start with 2 case studies, one from Brazil and one from Canada. The first study is going to be shared by José Neto of Brazil's National Agency for Waterway Transportation, or ANTAQ. He will share how Brazil uses climate risk assessments to build resilience in the Brazilian port sector. For the second case study, Virginia Sarrazin, the Climate Resilience Lead Advisor at WSP Golder, is going to share about how they assess the impacts of climate change on infrastructure in all Northwest Territory communities. And in our last input, Joel Nodelman, an associate of CRI, will share about the PIEVC portfolio screening guide along with Eric Sparling of CRI. The PIEVC Alliance has taken on the task of developing a guide on using the PIEVC for portfolio scale assessments based on experiences like those of Brazil and the Northwest Territories communities. Eric and Joel will share about the beta version of the guide. At the end of the inputs, we'll have time for Q&A. At any time, please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box and we'll address them at the end. Those questions we cannot get to today, we'll have a chance to discuss in our online networking practitioner space. Now I'd like to introduce our first presentation and speaker. José Neto has been working as a specialist in waterway transport regulation at Brazil's National Agency for Waterway Transportation since 2012 and currently holds the role of Development and Studies Manager. ANTAQ is is linked to the Ministry of Infrastructure with administrative and functional autonomy. ANTAQ is responsible for the regulation, tariff control, study and development of waterway transport in Brazil. José Neto, please, it's over to you. Thanks very much.
More recently, around 2018, GIZ has implemented this study for the Itajaí port after a big problem that we have that was a climate problem, that we had collapse of the embankment of the port. And we in the agency ANTAQ, we felt the need to go deeper in those studies that we had in the past and to make them more comprehensive, to cover other ports so that we could create guidelines for the regulations of our agency and the public policies that we should develop here in the Brazilian government. Can you put on the next slide? One more, please. So the main objective of this study was to identify the impacts and risks of climate change in the ports, in the public ports in Brazil. Just to remind you that we have coastal ports. We also have some riverine ports that have not been studied so far. And from those studies, we created some general recommendations and measures for adaptation to mitigate those risks. One more, please. And since the idea was to expand the references that we had regarding compared to those previous studies, we tried to convince and create agreements with the port authorities in the Brazilian coastal ports, and we expanded our basis for analysis, and we introduced the study for 21 ports in Brazil. So we go from a study that would comprise 2 ports only, which were Santos and Rio de Janeiro ports, and the GIZ study considered the Itajaí port, and then we expanded those bases to 21 ports. One more slide, please. One more. Just getting into the methodology now, in order to carry out those studies, we had an agreement signed for cooperation with GIZ, with a team in Brazil that already had some expertise in the climate risk analysis, and they have developed the study for the Itajaí port. So we adapted that methodology used in the Itajaí port, the methodology that the IPCC used, in order to adopt it for our own study. So the methodology would comprise initially a bibliographic review, the possible methods in order to adapt them to Brazilian reality. And then we had a strong interaction with the port authorities in Brazil so that we could identify the current hazards that we would have, climate hazards that we might have, that might bring some kind of damage to the ports. And then we were able to list the indicators that could show us the vulnerabilities and the exposure of those points. And that was the final objective of this stage of the study. We managed to come up with a rank for the climatic risk for each one of those ports. So we would quantify the risk and also list them and coordinate them according to each port. So by the end of it, the study also had the objective of surveying the possible adaptation measures in order to reduce those risks. One more slide, please. As I said before, in the previous study, we would consider only the increase of the sea level, and in the Brazilian study, and now we were able to expand through that interaction with the port authorities. We could expand our spectrum of climatic risks so we had strong winds, thunderstorms, and sea level rise. So all of those have been assessed from the interaction with the ports and assessing the impacts that they had in their daily operations in the ports for those 21 ports.
And using the right methodology for IPCC from 2014, we see that the climate risk is the interaction between the vulnerability, exposure, and hazards. And as I said at the beginning, we adapted this methodology to the Brazilian reality. Next slide, please. Here it's an example for strong winds and how we have the proxies built to the hazards, exposures, and vulnerabilities. And we always use extreme events and these indicators and to the climate change are related to extreme events. In this case, strong winds and exposures. The indicators are considering the infrastructure items of the port, the number of infrastructures that are affected, and also the annual cargo handling during a year. So the logic is that and talking about vulnerability, there's two sub-dimensions, sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And under sensitivity, we considered the condition of the sheltered area, cargo type, that depends on each port, and the kind of port regarding their protection infrastructure, if they're natural infrastructure. And it's important to highlight here that the cargo type, it's very important when you consider the hazard. In thunderstorms hazards, mineral cargo types are more exposed to climate change, or like strong winds, you have the other equipment that are very high that may be more exposed to strong winds. And adaptive capacity, we developed two KPIs there, and we subdivided in non-structural measures and structural measures. And these measures could be measures that can be adopted to minimize these impacts. Next slide, please. And you will see that now we are talking about thunderstorms, and the hierarchical structure is just the same. The only thing that changes are really the indicators. And we are talking about the rain level on a yearly basis, and also always considering extreme events. I don't want to talk too much about it because all the next indicators are very similar to what I talked for strong winds. Next slide, please. And here we see the indicators, KPIs for sea level rise, and we use the data from NASA for flooding about the coastal areas. And we have a provision for 2030 and 2050, how the Brazilian ports will be in these flooded areas. And these indicators are very similar to what I have already shown. And for this risk analysis, it's very similar to what I just showed you. Next slide, please. Next one, please. And now getting to the results and using this methodology that I told you, we were able to create this table for all the 21 ports, and it translates the risk related to the climate for each port that was studied in each climate risk that was studied. And it's important to highlight here that the climate hazards, we are considering here not only the history, because we considered the data from many years, from 1984 to 2004. We also used climate models to foresee this risk in the future. The objective is not only to measure the climate risk for the sports, but also foresee how this index will be in the future. And we considered two milestones, 2030 and 2050, and two RCPs, different RCPs, RCP 4.5 and the RCP 8.5. This is the result for strong winds, and the end on the right side, you can see the classes where we classify the risk from very low to very high. Please, next slide. In the same way, next slide, please. So based on this risk index, we can have a hierarchy, a ranking of climate risk for each of the ports that were studied, and we can have a general overview of the risks that are more important for each port, and you can direct public policies and resources thinking about adaptation of the sports. Next slide, please. In the same way, just next slide, please. We did the same for thunderstorms and sea level raising, and also foreseeing the future scenery, and also using RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5, and considering the climate models. Next slide, please. And here we also have a ranking based for thunderstorms, and it's an analysis that helps us to send the resource to the right place. Next slide, please. And since we are talking about thunderstorms, here we had a recent real case, and that we have and see the impact of the climate change. This is in Rio Grande, in south part of Brazil, and in a day of excess rain, they had flooding in parts of the port. Next slide, please. And another example at the port of Santos, the biggest in Brazil, and is the biggest port in South America. It's a really important port, economically speaking. And in a very rainy day, the fog that was created and the rain interfere in the shipping of sulfur, stopping the whole shipping for several minutes.
Ok. Próximo slide, por favor.
Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And the same way we did for the sea level rise, the ranking of the ports regarding this risk. Next slide. One more, please. And here we have a clear example, an interesting example actually. That's the model that we use to foresee the flooding areas in the Port of Santos. And if you see the big tank area in the north part, next slide, please. And if you compare this to this picture, this is exactly the risk of flooding that was presented, flooding of this area of liquids. And this is a real risk coming from the climate change in the Port of Santos. Next slide, please. One more. And just to explain, after all that, we created 55 possible adaptations, and these measures are structural adaptation measures and non-structural adaptation measures. And structural are high invest measures that involve engineering. And the study also showed which ports already are using of these measures in any way. Next slide, please. Okay, these are non-structural adaptation measures. Next slide, please. And getting to the conclusions, we have found that climate risks and adaptation assessments for ports are scarce in Brazil. As I said, we found only 3 studies. And the last one, the third one, is the biggest and more broad one. And another thing that we understood and saw there are no standardization of the data about climate change and correlating this information to the ports. So this is something we have learned. We need to get better data. And the most important conclusion of the study is that the port sector in Brazil already feels the climate change, and we saw in the results, if nothing is done, the future is that this risk will happen, these events will happen more often, and the impacts will get more dire. In the same way, we understood that only few ports in Brazil have any adaptation program, and this study represents a major step towards the inclusion of the climate change adaptation topic in the port sector in Brazil. It means we need to control better and create better public policies talking about the mitigation of these impacts. Next slide, please. So lessons learned. It's important to say the participation and engagement of the port authorities were crucial to the success of the study. It was crucial and it is still crucial to get the data. They have the access to the data in everyday life. And so their participation is fundamental to us. The contribution of the National Institute for Space Research was key to achieve the state of the art in developing climate change scenarios and to see also the future models. And a very important lesson that we learned, that we cannot rely only on climate model data. The use of observational data provided a more realistic condition of the current climate and risk level. Another topic is that about strong winds and thunderstorms are more difficult to model. There's a need for including more climate models in future assessments in order to estimate the uncertainties. And the last topic is, although not reported by the ports, sea level rise should not be underestimated and must be followed over time to avoid bad impacts for Brazilian ports. Next slide, please. And to get to the end, the next steps. So in this cooperation, we had two main axes. The first axis was I presented here, and the second axis, and we are finalizing it. And in the next opportunity, I hope I be able to present it to you. We elected 3 ports based on the highest climate risk. On the axis are Santos, Rio Grande, Aratu, Candeias, and we are not considering only the risk level, but also the economic importance of these ports, each in one different region of Brazil, so we can look to the main geographic regions of the country: south, southeast, and northeast region of the country. And also it's interest of this group that the result of this work was the developing of a guideline for assessing climate risk, and we want to expand the study to the 3 ports, to all public ports in Brazil. And this study was concluded in November 2022. And we are here at your disposal if you want to hear more about it. That's it. Thank you very much Thank you for your patience, and I'm here for you if you have questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, José Neto. I would go as far as saying that this is not only lessons learned and challenges that you faced in Brazil, but also I think it's a real gift to have you as part of this practitioners community and to share these experience because I think, yeah, there's countries all around the world that can learn from these efforts of Brazil. And we will also have some time for Q&A at the end of this session. So please share your questions in the chat box, share them in the chat. And yeah, thanks once more, José Neto, for this very interesting presentation. We will now go ahead and go a bit further north, looking at the continent, going to Canada now. And now we're going to hear from Virginia Zarazin. She is lead advisor for the Climate Risk and Resilience Group at WSP Canada and is located in Whitehorse, Yukon. Virginia has a background in water and wastewater treatment with 20 years of experience designing and managing projects in Quebec, British Columbia, and Yukon. I'm very much looking forward to the input. We're going to learn about applying climate change impact assessment, or climate change risk assessment to infrastructure in all Northwestern Territories communities. Also, kind reminder to you, Virginia, you have 20 minutes. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Katarina. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I will present about a project that WSP conducted in 2019, which consisted in a large-scale climate change risk and resilience assessment on a list of government of Northwest Territories and community-owned critical assets using the PIEVC protocol. Next slide, please. So first, a project overview. Next slide. So this project was led by MACA, being the Municipal and Community Affairs Department for the Government of Northwest Territories. We wanted to better understand the climate risks at the regional level on critical infrastructure for communities. So the assessment covered all the GNWT and community-owned infrastructure, excluding airports, winter roads, and highways. The funding came from CNAQ, Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, under the Climate Change Preparedness in the North program. And the overarching goal for MACA was to be able to better prioritize adaptations efforts and fiscal decisions. So it was a great proactive action item on the GNWT list. Next slide. The scope was more precisely to complete the comprehensive analysis of all potential climate impacts to focus department priorities for climate change adaptation, but also to improve knowledge of the climate change impacts occurring in the NWT. So the goal was to get pretty detailed information while only conducting high-level risk assessments on 33 communities' assets in a short period of time. And one of the strategy was to group communities per the 5 regions already defined by the GNWT. So that means the North and South Slave regions, the Deschutes, the Satu, and the Beaufort Sea Delta region. Next slide. So like I mentioned, the PIEVC protocol was used for the first time by WSP to complete such a high-level assessment with a few twists. For step 1 and 2, we did not perform the site visits because that would have been like really time-consuming and expensive. So we relied a lot on the local knowledge of MACA staff and other relevant representatives who could inform us on the assets, their condition, and also on the operation and maintenance practices for the infrastructure. For step 3, the risk assessment, we did not break down the components of each infrastructures. So we remained at the asset category level, meaning that we looked at roads, water treatment plants, sewage collection system, and so on. When we know that going at the component level could have helped increase or decrease the vulnerability of each component. Also, a 3-day workshop was conducted with multiple government departments to gather all the information required on assets and also discuss risk tolerance. No engineering analysis was conducted just because there were so many assets and so many different design criteria. And finally, at step 5, we conducted a data gap analysis and provided recommendations on policy, action items, and prioritization for future investigation. Next slide. In terms of climate data, the historical baseline was extracted from the historical data sets available and climate normals on the Environment and Climate Change Canada website and from the Canadian Disaster Database. For projections, we used online available tools such as the Climate Atlas of Canada and the IDFCC tool. And we developed past and future trends at the regional level using community weather stations or grid points. Next slide. So to conduct the high-level assessment, we needed to do some assumptions for the climate data, and we identified those assumptions and limitations and data gaps to the clients. So in terms of the climate trends, of course, doing climate modeling at the regional level is more granular, but conducting climate modeling at the community scale would have been way too time-consuming and costing a lot of money as well. So it was assumed that climate data were similar for communities of the same region since they are located close to each other. Incorporation of traditional knowledge for climate observation was not done because it's way more useful at a local level than a regional level. There were no flood levels projections available, so historical floodplain high water levels were used for qualitative assessment of potential fluvial flooding, which remains a big data gap. Projecting ice jam processes required extensive data processing and modeling that could not be done at this level. The permafrost distribution maps at the time of the project were not available at the community scale. They are available now at the regional level. So we used the 5th edition of the National Atlas of Canada, which of course has a high granularity. And so sensitivity to permafrost degradation was assumed homogeneous with each communities of the same region. Next slide. In terms of the infrastructure that we looked at, they were grouped in 3 categories. Civil and municipal assets were including ferry and marine transportations, roads, water source, treatment and distribution, sewage collection and treatment, solid waste facilities, stormwater drainage infrastructure, park and golf course, and cemeteries, so quite a bit of them. Buildings included community housing units, offices, schools, hospitals, health center, fire stations, recreational complex, community center, and greenhouses. And energy included fuel storage and tank farms, including marine resupply, power plants, solar farms, power lines and poles, and telecommunications. So a total of 25 assets were considered per region. So that's quite a big number, but all these assets were actually pretty critical for each of these communities, which are pretty remote. Next slide, please. So a total of 27 climate indicators were considered to capture climate-related hazards. The 5 primary climate hazards that were looked at were permafrost degradation, the flooding, wildfire, coastal erosion, and or submersion, and snow load. And that all this resulted in a total of 19 and 2 climate infrastructure interactions considered for the assessment. Next slide, please. So now the risk assessment process itself. Yeah, thank you. So nothing really different from usual. The risk was considered the product of the probability of the impact by the severity of the events. So the probability is the probability of the climate parameters changing over the time horizon of the assessment, such that the infrastructure threshold is triggered. And we use the scale rated from 1 to 7 based on the PIEVC scale rating. 1 meaning that the interaction between the climate hazard and the component will be negligible, and 7 meaning it will be highly probable. For the severity, we needed to consider how severe will the impacts be on the infrastructure if the hazard occurs. So again, we use the scale from 1 to 7, 1 meaning the severity will be negligible, and 7 meaning it will be extreme, even leading to a loss of assets. So like I mentioned, we defined some climate thresholds for each climate infrastructure interaction. Some came from the National Building Code, some from historical events, and some from the literature. Next slide, please. And here is a risk scoring scale that we use to assess the level of risk. So we went from low risk to moderate low risk to moderate high risk, and special cases. So special cases being when there is a low probability and high severity, or high probability and a low severity. So those are specifically discussed with the client to understand if they want to bring them to higher level of risk or just ignore them. And the high risk rating, of course, means that a particular interaction should be prioritized for action or study, but it doesn't mean that the piece of infrastructure is at immediate risk of failure. It can take several years, but still need to be planned for. Next slide. So I mentioned those three risk workshops. They were absolutely critical for the quality of the assessments. 3 workshops for each infrastructure categories were conducted. And they engage people living and working in the north, so they understand the local context, and they have a deep knowledge of the infrastructure. So we use a lot of people from the Northwest Territories government, from MACA, infrastructure in design and technical services, in transportation, environment, and we also had some specialists from Environment and Climate Change Canada regarding the climate data. And during these workshops, we reviewed the relevant climate change projections to make sure that they were actually making sense, that we, based on the local observations. We confirmed the critical infrastructure components to maintain with a minimum required level of service at all time. And we helped build the consensus on the sensitivity of infrastructure types to identify climate variable and severity of impact. Next slide. So a bit more detail on the risk on the assessment results themselves. So out of the 19 and 2 interactions analyzed, about half of the interactions were ranked as moderate low risk, and 37% were ranked as low risk. So that was good news. For the remaining interaction, 9% were ranked as moderate high risk, and less than 1% were ranked as high risk. And recommendation for resilience were only developed for moderate high risk and high risks. Next slide. So here is pretty much a summary of the result we found out. I'm not going to go through each of them, but in general, those interactions were permafrost degradation and thaw leading to degradation of roads and foundations or erosions through settlement. But further damage can result from the water also result from the water released by the permafrost melting. Flooding from extreme rain events combined with rapid melt of snow in the spring results in drainage infrastructure not being able to handle the flow and the volume and resulting in flooding of roads and buildings. In terms of wildfires, of course, in addition to being a direct danger to the infrastructure itself, it also results in the melting of permafrost and creates more additional runoff and loss of absorption capacity from the ground without the trees. Sea level rise and storm surge can lead to flooding and coastal erosions, and increased snow loads mean additional maintenance to remove the snow from roads and buildings, more water runoff in the spring, and also potential collapse of roofs that were not designed for such a snow load. In summary, high risk can lead to major damage to assets, loss of assets, changes in duration and periods of resupply operations, which are critical for remote communities. So, for example, some of them rely on winter roads, and if those winter roads cannot be maintained for the right period of time, they lose the resupply capacity. Yeah. So next slide, please. So here is pretty much how we presented the information per region. So you have all the 25 assets listed there, and we tried to, so what you see in the letters here are temperature, permafrost melting, flooding, and so on. So that was a visual way to identify the main risks per region. In general, the key themes for all the infrastructures where SAT2 and Beaufort Delta regions present the highest risks for all infrastructures related to permafrost melt. Precipitation, permafrost melt, and wildfire presents moderate high risks across many regions and infrastructure types. And flooding and erosion are also prevalent risks for several types of infrastructure in the South Slave and Beaufort Delta regions. Next slide. So although the reports and the study was conducted at the regional level, we were able to produce some community profiles for each of the 33 communities we assessed, providing more specific information for those communities, so the information was readily available and relevant for them. And we removed the consideration for impact that won't apply. For example, the Beaufort Delta region has some coastal erosion risks that don't apply for a lot of the inland communities. And the community profile also gave recommendation actions even for lower risk infrastructure. So that was a way to be proactive for each community to make sure that this lower risk would not become higher risk in the future. So here is an example of a community profile that we did for the community of Dr. ANTAQ on the Beaufort Delta front. So some example of the adaptation measure that were provided were to complete an additional characterization of the permafrost. So there was a big data gap in terms of understanding what's going on with the permafrost. You know that the rate of increasing temperature is 3 times higher in the north. So it's really hard to follow what's going on with the permafrost until you see and observe what's happening to the ground. But monitoring is really something that needs to be done. Increased snow removal needed to promote preservation of the permafrost, or remove this insulation layer and avoid overloadings of buildings. Monitor the areas of settlement to make sure they don't degrade too quick. Monitor the ground temperature near or under critical infrastructures. Monitor coastal erosion and parameters mostly contributing to it, and develop a flood mitigation plan including relocation of critical infrastructures where possible, and avoidance of development in flood zone. And a cost benefits analysis would help guide the decision process, and also prepare a flood response plan. Next slide, please. So in addition to this community profile, we also use like basic GIS technology to overlay the critical infrastructure we looked at with the major risks and vulnerabilities that were identified. So that was a visual tool for the community. Next slide, please. Here is an example of another community, Fort Good Hope. So we had pretty much the same recommendation as Dr. ANTAQ. We also recommended to limit the development in areas of high risk for wildfires, clean up around fuel tanks, and plan for firefighting, because surprisingly some of these fuel tank farms don't have any protection. Confirm the flood risk. So the flood map is so granular right now that it shows that the whole community is at risk of flooding. So by conducting a bit more of data gathering from the past, and also conducting more hydrological modeling at the local level, you can identify actually some safe spots that could be used during an emergency. Identify the areas with higher risk of erosion and prepare a flood response plan, which was, I think, pretty much a recommendation for everybody. Next slide. So again, that's the example of a map that was done for Fort Good Hope. So we did that for each of the 33 communities. And next step to conclude my presentation, basically, we recommended to the government on those territories to share the results with the communities to make sure that we build education and awareness of what's going on. Collect information from traditional knowledge and cross-reference it with what has already been collected at a scientific level. Prioritize the resilience measures and apply for funding, and also continue building the community awareness of climate change impacts on infrastructures, value and record the local observation, and also collect the feedback on resilience measures that are actually put in place. Following this study, we are now starting a new phase of the project with the government of the Northwest Territories, where they want us to look to develop an assessment framework to assess and prioritize over 1,000 of their assets. So it's going to include the asset that we already have here, but also the highways, the winter roads, bridges, and airport that were not included in this study. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'd be happy to answer any question that you may have. Yeah, I don't know if my email address will be available, but I'd be happy to answer by email as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Virginia, for sharing this experience. And I think it has already been shared in the chat that this is really interesting to see these two examples side by side. Also, I think everybody that has worked with the PIEVC will notice some common themes, like the importance of the climate service expert being part of the team, as Elvis Song has already shared in the chat box. So yeah, thank you so much. We will have some time for questions at the end of this session. We already have quite a few questions in the chat box and in the Q&A box, which we will get to later. Before I want to hand over to our last presenters, which is going to be two presenters. we are going to hear from Eric Sparling, who is the Vice President of the Climate Risk Institute. Eric has 15 years of experience providing and overseeing the delivery of research, analysis, training, and decision support services for the management of climate-related risks across various infrastructures and natural resource sectors. And we're going to hear from Joel Nodelman, who is an engineering and risk management specialist with over 40 years of professional experience in the field. He's been involved in the PIEVC program from the very beginning and also is one of the experts that have been working on the PIEVC portfolio screening guide, the beta version of which is what they are going to share about today. And you will notice some of the lessons learned from these examples we heard about now in this beta version. So Eric and Joel, over to you. And a reminder, you have 10 minutes.
Yes, and Katrina, in the interest of time, we're probably going to streamline it with Joel taking this largely. I just preface it very quickly to say that the process for developing the guideline or the manual that Joel's about to speak to involved, of course, looking at kind of current state of practice, including important case studies and approaches like the ones that we were just taken through in the last 2 case studies. And maybe I'll just say now that this guide is not yet, or manual is not yet officially released. There's some process still to go through with the National Advisory Committee for PIEVC that will happen prior to its release, but we expect it to be released in beta version towards the end of January. So I think with that, I'll just hand directly to Joel. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, everybody. And can we go to the next slide, please, very quickly? I want to streamline this. I'm going to focus mostly today on what our manual is saying, as opposed to defining a very specific process and teaching a process. So basically, our process involved looking at, we did look at these 2 previous case studies. They informed a lot of what we developed. And then a lot of work around trying to come to a consistent process that could simplify this for folks going forward. And the first question we had to confront is, what is a portfolio? I mean, what we found was a lot of interesting discussion around this in various project reports and in the academic literature, in the gray literature. So this definition, the 2 key points that drive this are, it's a group of assets that's controlled by an entity, and it's viewed through a consistent risk lens, so that you're looking at the same sort of risk appetites as you look at the entire portfolio. It becomes really difficult if you have multiple owners, multiple risk appetites. Next slide, please. Also, we had some really long and engaging discussions on what do we mean by portfolio. We've seen a couple of examples of this today in similar assets in many locations. The manual also defines portfolio as a linear system that covers different climatic zones. So it could be a highway that goes a very long distance. It could be also one location, like a municipality, that has many assets that it wants to sort out. So different sorts of assets within the portfolio. And then finally, many locations with many assets. So you can see the complexity of this is that you want to define a process that will work for all of these scenarios, and still comply with the principles of PIEVC and ISO 14090, ISO 31000. So next slide, please. What we landed on was this concept of using archetypes and indicators. Now, archetype I'll go into in a few moments, but basically in the previous example, we're talking about asset classes. That's a basic archetype. We expanded that definition, and then once again we had to do some work around what does archetype specifically mean. It was very interesting literature review looking for archetypes. There's many papers on this. They all define very clearly what they mean, and they don't all agree. So we had to do some work around what does that mean for this process. And we also view this as an iterative process, going back to the comment about having to have the climate expertise at the table, that you develop archetypes and climate indicators in unison, and it goes back and forth a little bit, just like any other PIEVC process where we want to identify and understand how those things might work. Next slide, please. The manual provides a lot of detail on how to go about defining things like archetypes and indicators. So if for an archetype, we would look for a set of representative system assets, and we would describe its size, its configuration, the ages, the geography, the component makeup and mix. So what sort of systems are we looking at, its capability and limitations, and then we embed within all of that some of the sensitivity around climate design. So specific climate parameters that might have been taken into account in its construction. This chart on the right is an example. It is just drawn right out of the air, but it's basically an archetype of two different buildings within a common portfolio. So it's an owner who has some historic resources that they have to deal with. Older buildings may have historical designations. They could be really old, 100 years old. A different value than some other assets, and some of that value may be commercial value, but also there's a cultural value that may be associated with some of these things. And then the sensitivities that it may need to have, and finally, adaptive capacities that are already built into the system that needs to be taken into account. The contrast, that's still a building in the same portfolio. It's a high rise. It's mixed office and lease space. It's more urban. It's got a much newer design. It has different climate sensitivities involved in it, and then so we basically, while they're both buildings, they're different archetypes. And within the manual, we would define those separately. Next, please. So basically, the manual provides detailed instructions and worksheets for constructing these. So we're not just kind of laying out these definitions, say go to it. We're saying, here's some things you may want to consider, the questions you may want to answer, and here's some guidance in the form of worksheets, etc. Next slide. The overall process for the portfolio assessment is very similar to what we've been hearing about this morning. We look at our climate hazards, the sensitivities, any adaptive capacities built in the system. We do a detailed performance response analysis, leading into indicator and archetype analysis. And then there's a couple of paths you can take in terms of going from vulnerability analysis then to risk analysis, or you could just sidestep all of that and go directly to risk analysis. So it's got some flexibility in terms of how you may want to approach this. Next slide, please. We view this as part of a cycle. So you would do a portfolio assessment to sort, to understand where your hot spots might be over a larger portfolio of assets. And then you would iterate back to that and look at those hotspots, maybe with a high-level screening assessment or a detailed PIEVC assessment or other processes. You may just kick them over to an engineering team to have them say, okay, these are hotspots we need to deal with. So it becomes part of a process, and it's iterative. You keep coming back to this. So the question that we were struggling with is, let's say you were an owner who had 1,000 buildings you had to deal with across the country. How would you sort through that to identify where you need to put your resources right now and where you've got a bit of time to look at that? So the portfolio screening manual is designed to answer that sort of question. Next slide, please. It's laid out, the manual is laid out in this way. There's two streams you can follow. One is, and at the very top it says experiences. Basically, how much experience do you have with doing this sort of work? And if you don't have a lot and you want to inform yourself before you dive in. Then you take the left-hand stream and it takes you through what is a portfolio, what is vulnerability and risk, how would you go about doing performance response, what are archetypes and climate indicators. The other side of this is more instructional in terms of set up your team, do your scope and assessment, do your configure assessment, do your vulnerability, do your risk analysis. So very much like a user manual in that regard. And so once you've into this, you may just bypass the left-hand stream and go right to the right hand, just getting the instructions and tables and all of that you might need. Next slide, please. Eric, this is back to you. This is our release schedule. You briefly mentioned this, but I put a slide in for you anyway.
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, and I don't think I'll go back through this, but just to say that there are a couple of steps to get through yet. Importantly, with the National Advisory Committee, and maybe also just to plug that among the next steps also is looking for opportunities to do some beta version piloting with this manual to accompany folks on projects that are lined up to do portfolio type assessments. So would appreciate people keeping in that mind and be in touch with us if you're interested in perhaps being part of that beta testing cohort. So thanks very much.
The next slide, please. And this is my very last slide, but this is actually a little bit for all of us as homework. And this gets back to the Practitioners Network. We've got here some starter questions for a dialogue or chatting in the Practitioners Network space. And the starter questions are, have you done a portfolio assessment? What resources would have helped you in your work? Are you contemplating doing a portfolio assessment? What advice, resources, tools will help you on your way? And then any other questions you might want to raise about this particular issue. And with that, I know my time's up, and I am happy to take questions as we move forward in today's session.
Thank you so much, Eric and Joel, and thank you to all the speakers for being so good about the time of your presentations. So we still have some time left for our Q&A. Also, thanks a lot to the speakers because you already started to answer a lot of the questions in the chat box. I still want to pick out a specific question because I think it could be relevant to all the speakers of today, which is a question that was raised by Matt and already answered by Virginia, but I would still like to hear your thoughts on this. Matt has been asking the asset class, or looking back to the guideline, the archetype approach makes a lot of sense for municipalities that have large multi-service portfolios. Did you find that some specific asset concerns, although not formally indexed, fell out of the asset class discussion? So basically asking what are maybe the limitations that you realized when trying to lump infrastructures together? And I think, Virginia, you're already hinting at a solution you may be working on. So maybe you want to share your answer with the bigger group and explain a bit more about what you want to continue doing about this question. But then I would also be interested in hearing from José Neto and Joel and Eric about this idea of, okay, where do you see the challenges and potential solutions moving forward for this question? But Virginia, maybe you want to start with this question.
Yeah, so of course, like going high level, we missed a lot on the sensitivity of each asset because we didn't look specifically at how they were designed, what type of construction it was, this kind of thing. So with this new phase of the project, that's what we're trying to do. We talked to the specialist of each type of infrastructure and we asked them, what do you think makes your asset more sensitive to climate? So I mentioned some examples in the chat there, but like, for example, for buildings, we're going to look at the type of foundations, which can be really impacted by permafrost melting. We're going to look at the age. It's really important, of course, because it dictates the type of design that was used for it, and so on. So we're just starting, and right now we're meeting with each specialist at the government of these assets to determine with them, like, what do you think exactly makes your asset sensitive? And that's what we're going to use for the framework.
Thank you so much for this answer. Also shows how valuable this kind of analysis can be to really see where you need further investigation, but you don't start at zero, but you already have some rough screening at the beginning before you go deeper into this question. I'm not sure, José Neto, whether you have any thoughts on this question of how, like, what were maybe challenges you faced or things that you have taken up in the second step of your analysis that you couldn't go that deeply into in the first stage of the portfolio screening.
Catarina, no nosso caso aqui, a nossa grande dificuldade.
In our case, our huge difficulty is about systematized data. It's very difficult to correlate the data with the eventual damages and the halts in the port operations. We know that the regulating agency can stimulate the port authorities to gather better data, that in the future this makes it easier to replicate the study in other ports in Brazil. And answering your question about challenges and the future, from the point of view of the agency, in the first step, we want to get these free studies to other ports, and in order for them to have the needed information to incorporate the climate change data in their management and planning tools. The agency also has a very efficient instrument that is regulation through incentives, that is called IDA, and our proposal is to incorporate some of the indicators of this study to incentivize the ports to use climate change studies in their routine. And with this study, we got to the main goal, that is to bring light to these questions and stimulate ports to think about the future and work preventively regarding the climate change risks and consequent impacts.
Thank you so much. Also, like, a very important issue. I think, like, we always think about the climate challenges and thinking about the future, but the historical data on impacts can also be quite hard to come by. I'm sorry, maybe you were not finished, sorry.
Sim, sim. A agência, ela tem
The agency has a port work system with optional data about the halts and the ports, and these data are specific about the climate changes and the climate impacts when the port must stop working. And in the future, we want to get this data in a recurrent way and in a mandatory way, so we have a bigger data mass in the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Not sure, is there a reaction by Joel and Eric to this question of what you suggest or what your anticipation is in terms of using the this new approach and where we may, of course, see we may need further study based on having to lump different assets together?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is that we designed the manual, the process, with the concept of it being a screening. If you have a handful of assets, you probably wouldn't need to do this. But well, the question we were confronting was what happens if you have many, many, many assets of different classes across the board in your that you have to manage, and that's a complex question, and we've seen a number of approaches, and the team that put this together all have experience in dealing with these sorts of questions. And what we sussed out was, what are we doing that's consistent across the board in terms of sorting through the assets. The problem is always going to be that whether an archetype or an asset class is a general definition. It's not going to cover everything. And so you want to spend a fair amount of effort just thinking about and putting that together carefully. And it becomes like a bit of a push and pull, because the more definition you provide, the more asset classes or archetypes you define, and then ultimately you end up with the portfolio again. So you're trying to work out what works best in this context. And so there's a fair amount of back and forth that goes into the development of this. And we expect that will be a challenge. And while we've provided guidance for that, I expect as a practitioner that to be a challenge in every assessment. It's just, how far do you need to go to make it reasonable without, and we're always facing the same issues. We're balancing budget, we're balancing time, we're balancing resources against getting some meaningful results. So, and the manual provides a lot of guidance on how to get around that, but at the end of the day, it's up to us as practitioners to help our clients, the owners, solve those questions.
Thank you so much. And I think also, hopefully, if we find some more piloting studies, that we will get more advanced even further with that and learning from these future applications of the methodology. I think also, if you are interested in seeing the results, at least for Brazil, José Neto has shared them in the chat if you want to look at the study, and for sure we will also share all the presentations and the materials in the chat and also in the practitioners networking space. I'm looking into the Q&A box, but I think we have answered basically all the questions that were in there. I'm not sure whether there's any question you would like to react on. I think we had quite a big discussion, or not discussion, but agreement, I would say, on the questions of having the climate services for these PIEVC assessments and how important they are. I think it's also something we covered in our last webinar. If you are interested, you can look at this one again. And also, I think Christine has shared in the chat her appreciation of these examples and their importance for using this as a, she's called it the pre-PIEVC. I think in both cases, the portfolio assessment is the basis for doing a more in-depth assessment at a later stage. But really seeing the role of these assessments is quite valuable to us. Just seeing whether there's any more questions in the group, or maybe we want to tackle one of your questions, Joel, you would like to raise to the practitioners community that you had on your presentation.
Yeah, I think I would be interested in comments on both sides of that question. Have you done portfolio assessment? And we have some clear examples of people who have, but for the rest of us within the webinar, have you done it? What are your experiences around that? What would have helped you? Because I think looking forward to piloting the manual, what we're really trying to find out now is, what do we need to do to tweak this to make it a final version? And so that sort of input. And the other question is, hey, if you're contemplating doing this, what's putting you off getting started? What do you need? And how can we help with what we're building into the manuals?
I think you will also already be receiving the opportunity at a later stage to maybe have a look at this manual and share your comments on this. Yeah, please, if anybody already wants to share in the chat about their experience or their interest in using the portfolio screening tool, we would be very much interested. Also later, you will have the chance in the PIEVC Practitioners Network, in the online networking space, to share those.
Katerina, I've already put the questions in there that Joel posed, so I added him, and so he will get notification, and we'll also send those out to the group as well. There is another question in the Q&A box though for you. Does PIEVC offer a pathway to integrating traditional knowledge, as in the NWT example? Maybe Joel wants to weigh in there.
I can pop in, but also Eric, I think the First Nations toolkit has been designed specifically to do that. And I'm not sure where it is in its release schedule, but it is coming pretty quick. So, and I would emphasize that the need to integrate both traditional and local knowledge into these sorts of assessment is critical, because that's where you find out where most of the issues really are. And we need to take these things. So yes, there are ways. We've recognized that as a need, and it's being taken care of as we speak.
Thank you, Joel. Any further comments, Eric? Do you have an update on the release schedule, or?
Only, I just maybe want to check. I think Elmer Lickers, who is steward of that First Nations Resiliency Toolkit, was on the line. I don't see him, but Elmer, just in case you could jump on. But otherwise, perhaps others in the audience too might have reflections on that, which I guess could be put in the chat.
But else, I think we can get back.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Yeah, we can get back to with the answers to the question. If Elmer, if you're no longer in this group and can share in the chat, we can get this information shared later on. One question, because it was hidden a bit in the Q&A box, I want to address. There was a question about the question of natural assets and how this is going to be followed up. And I want to invite you to join us in our webinar in February, where we are actually going to talk about using PIEVC and climate risk assessments in this context of natural essence and the green-gray intersection. So if you join us in February, we will be sharing more about this in that session and hearing examples for that as well. Joel, you wanted to comment?
I was just, I was going to say that, and I'm glad you did. But I also wanted to point to a question in the chat about would it be useful to have an up-to-date differentiation between vulnerability and risk assessment? And I didn't say that in my presentation, but the manual that we're discussing today does that in copious detail.
Thanks a lot for catching that, Joel. So the manual will go into this, and then I have a last question by Daryl on the question of the risk tolerance. So just asking maybe to all the presenters, what was the risk tolerance? What did you work with in your studies? And if you could talk a bit about that. Who wants to go first? Maybe Virginia, if you could go first.
Yeah, so in our case, a lot of this infrastructure we looked at, the assets are critical for the operation of day-to-day operation of the community. But we had to ask them, in case of an acute event, what are you really willing to lose, basically, and are you able to rely on other resources such as more maintenance, more operations, people on the ground, or emergency preparedness? So that's really this balance that we're trying to assess between what you need really 24/7. All year long, and what can you lose for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, this kind of thing.
Thank you so much. José Neto, any thoughts on your end on the question of risk tolerance? How did you address it?
Sim, no nosso caso,
yes, in our case, this was a very particular requirement for each one of the port infrastructures, because here we are speaking about different assets involving different movement, different traffic in the ports, and also the financial issue is different for each one of those. So 1 day halt in Santos will be very different from 1 day halt in Aratu port, right? So Santos, as I said, is the biggest one in Brazil and South America. So the tolerance for risk would be quite variable regarding the infrastructure, depending on the infrastructure we are speaking about. So this would be depending on each port, and each one of them will introduce them into their acceptable risk level, as we call it. So they would not necessarily be the same, and I would say it would be different depending on the size and on the quantity of movement in each one of those ports, depending on the time of the year even. So this should be assessed by the agents and considered by according to the level of tolerance and the risk, and considering the magnitude and relevance of each one of those ports.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think we are coming towards the end of this session. We just have a few more items of housekeeping before we close. Also, thank everyone, for this very active participation and sharing your questions. Also having some new thoughts, food for thought, I think, for the practitioners community and the PIEVC Alliance on the next way forward. Claire, if you could put up the slides, please. So what do we have in the pipeline? In January, we're going to talk about the applications of the PIEVC high-level screening guide. The session is going to be facilitated by Dan Sanding. And as announced in February, we're going to talk about the PIEVC green, so talking about the gray-green intersection. And then, quickly getting into the global forum. So I want to invite you to join us in the practitioners networking space to learn more on that and to stay posted, because the registrations for the global forum are opening in January. So next slide, please. So there is no slide. Thank you so much for taking part today. Please also, Claire will share a link for a survey in the chat. We are always looking forward to your feedback on these webinars. Get in touch with us anytime if you have any more suggestions, questions on the series Global Forum. Also, I'm very much looking forward to learning more from you and meeting you in the online networking space and in Vancouver next year. Thanks a lot also again, of course, to all our presenters for these very exciting case studies we learned about today. So with this, please don't forget to copy the survey link, but we're closing for today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye, everyone.